and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video. Happy New Year and all that, so I hope you are well. Today we're going to talk about something pretty insignificant, which is, why do we exist? As far as theists are concerned, let's think about omni-God, my favourite idea because it's so broken. The idea of an omnipotent God, one that is all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, and omnibenevolent, all-loving. And you can throw in omnipresent and all these other kind of ideas as well, eternal. But those main three attributes of omni-God really do cause a lot of problems. And with omniscience, I want to include full divine foreknowledge, which means God knows in advance of creating everything that will or could come to pass, depending on what creation God, decides upon. And this can include counterfactual knowledge. So if God was to create this world, this would happen. God decides not to create this world, but he has knowledge of everything that would take place in that hypothetical world. So divine foreknowledge is it's a pretty big thing. And I'm going to assume that because that's what most theists in classical theism would adhere to. And I think it's a massive problem, and it gets theists of these believers in the classical theistic God, it gets them into a bit of a bind. But without it, creation is pretty random. So I understand why theists have to hold to divine foreknowledge, but it is a huge problem. So let's talk about why we exist. Why did God create at all? I think this is one of the questions that just doesn't get asked enough and doesn't get answered enough. Because actually, when you talk about judgment, heaven, hell, what goes on earth, really it only makes sense when you understand why God would have created in the first place. What's the point of humanity? But no one really grapples enough with that question, so that it's left a bit open, and it's all like dealing with the details down here, but you haven't kind of worked out the overall scheme of everything. That's hugely important. I was just listening to a Jewish rabbi on YouTube who was saying that God didn't create because God needed something or had a lack, and absolutely, completely agree. If you believe that God is ontologically perfect before creation, which is what the ontological argument states, perfect being theology states, this idea that before God creates, God is and has to be necessarily so an ontologically perfect entity. Okay, so if God has complete perfection, God has no need to do anything, no lacking. And you can argue all sorts of things, like God really shouldn't have wants or desires, because that in turn shows a lacking of something. But if God's perfect, ontologically perfect, God can have no lack of anything, can't be anything short of perfection, so it should have no needs or wants. And this Jewish rabbi said, well, okay, so that God can have no wants or needs, therefore God is creating to bestow love and goodness upon his creations. So it's all about bestowing love and goodness on humans in this case. Which is interesting because it's pretty obvious that there is a lot of suffering going on. The problem of evil raises its ugly head again, and rightly so, because it is a huge problem. Because if you're going to say, okay, the reason for creation is for God to bestow love upon everyone, then you have to explain robustly and soundly why there is so much suffering. If God wants to bestow love and goodness upon us, why also introduce malaria and tsunamis and pandemics and death and war and genocide and all these kind of things? That's not bestowing love and goodness on us. And the rabbi said, rightly so, that all religions are an attempt to kind of explain this chaotic world in terms of this kind of God. Yeah, damn straight. I just don't think you can do it. All you can do is of course skeptical theism, which is we don't know the mind of God. There must be a reason that such suffering exists. Just because we can't provide the reason doesn't mean there isn't a reason. No, but you know what? If you're saying that it's better that God hides that reason from us, or that we literally can't grasp the understanding, so God can't tell us because we wouldn't understand. I mean, we're trying to understand quantum physics at the moment, and yet apparently we can't understand or shouldn't understand why there is malaria and death and all this terrible stuff going on Earth, and has been since creation. So skeptical theism doesn't work for me, and the logical problem of evil is a probabilistic problem of evil, which is, well, do you know what? On balance, it doesn't look like there is this omni-God, because quite frankly, we exist with all this suffering, and no good reason has been presented for such suffering. You know, theologians fight over what theodicies, what defences of suffering might hold, but a lot of them are mutually exclusive, and none of them really explain natural evil adequately. And it's all a pretty dodgy pastime, I think, you know, trying to morally excuse what effectively looks like genocide, divine genocide. So there you go. Why create? And it's such an important question, because then you're setting out a kind of objective for humanity such that judgment makes sense. So if you're going to create humanity and then you're going to judge them, and then they're going to heaven or hell, or there's some kind of general resurrection, or whatever your beliefs about the afterlife are, then these only make sense in terms of what your objectives are in creating in the first place. So it's such a fundamental, it's the only question that needs answering, because everything should really come out of that. So the afterlife doesn't, and judgment doesn't really make sense, again, as nothing really does in terms of divine foreknowledge. If you know which humans are going to, you know, do well and which humans aren't going to do well, then why are you creating the heaven? Why are you creating the humans that you know aren't going to do so well? You are creating them so that they get punished, they go to hell, or they don't get the reward. And that seems inherently evil. It seems just a nasty way of operating. It's like these entities that have no choice over their creation are being created so that they can fail, knowingly so, as far as God's concerned, and be condemned to whatever fate awaits them. It seems pretty terrible. And it doesn't look like God is creating in order to bestow goodness and love upon his creations, if that is what is happening. I don't think there's much of a way around this, and it's a huge problem. The other thing worth thinking about here is an idea I've written about in my book, Why I Am Atheist and Not a Theist, a book that I think you should all get. One of the arguments against this kind of God that I talk about, and actually I discuss this even more in a book that's just about to come out called 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, is this idea of experiential knowledge. So if God, it's linked to that kind of hypotheticals, God would know what would take place in a world that he could hypothetically create but doesn't create. But also, I think there's this idea that if God is ontologically perfect, then I think a perfect being would have experiential knowledge. That means God would have the experience of interacting. God would have the knowledge of the experience of interacting with entities that he's created, even if he doesn't create them. Which is to say, there's this hypothetical world. Let's imagine this world that we live in is hypothetical, but God doesn't create it, right? But even though God doesn't create it, he can imagine creating it in such a way that he experiences the creation of this world, and he experiences the interaction he has with those hypothetical entities, and he experiences the love that he bestows upon those that do well, and also, you know, experiences the suffering of those who don't do so well. But the point here is that he doesn't need to create that world if he can experience it. In other words, the fact that I've got multiple sclerosis, or someone's got malaria, or someone dies in a car crash doesn't need to happen, because God can experience it and imagine it in such a way that's synonymous with it being created, but it's not actually created. In other words, those people who suffer don't actually suffer. And this gets around the problem of a lot of the problem of evil, which is that God can imagine these things in such a real way, and yet he doesn't need to create all the suffering and evil and pain. So therefore God doesn't look so evil. But the problem is God does create the suffering, evil and pain. I know this because cogito ergo sum. At least I know 100% that I exist, right? I can't speak on behalf of all of you guys. You could be figments of my imagination. But I know that I exist and I suffer. I suffer daily with my MS. I suffer with other things, stubbing my toe or doing this or my perceptions of the world, and the fact that I see so much suffering out there hurts me, and so on and so forth. So it appears that God doesn't just live on this idea of experiential knowledge, that he has to create anyway, and that in this creation there is suffering. And we're left just wondering what the point of that is, you know. Again, to go back to this divine foreknowledge, if you know in advance the result, imagine you're a teacher, right? And you're testing your children. The reason you test them is because you don't know what their ability or knowledge is in a given area. So you test them, and that informs you of what they know. But if you're God, you don't need to test people, because you know exactly what they're like. And you know indubitably any counterfactual about them, any if-then statement about every single entity. So there's no need to test humans at all. So the idea that the world is a test and we get judged is rendered incoherent in light of God's omniscience and divine foreknowledge. God has absolutely no need to test human subjects, unless the testing is about us and for us. But then you have to start explaining what is the benefit of creating humans that you know will fail a test in every possible world, arguably, because otherwise you create a possible world in which they don't fail if you're nice. But it appears to be that God has chosen this particular world, and there must be some maximally good reason he's chosen to create this particular world, because otherwise, if there's any gratuitous evil or pain, then God is not omnibenevolent. So this must be in some sense the maximally loving world, or optimal world, and yet there is pain and suffering. How can that be? You know, if that's all about us taking this test, and God knows in advance that a certain amount of people fail the test and be condemned to whatever fate awaits them, that's pretty negative, then how's that good for that entity? And we return to this idea that the creation is bestowing goodness and love upon the created entities doesn't work for those who are condemned and knowingly condemned. It's just the whole thing, like, you're going back to the beginning and saying, why create anything? It's why I start at the beginning in my section on natural theology in this book, and take it outwards, which is, you know, why create anything? I can't see why God would create, you know, unless God isn't omni. Then you can start making a little bit of sense about it, because that can allow evil and suffering and pain into any kind of creation. But if you're an omni-God and you are with those attributes creating, I don't think this created world makes any sense of an omni-God. I don't know. What are your thoughts about this? Well, I mean, as a Christian, any of you ex-Christians out there, all Christians, what is the point of creation? Why did God create? Especially in light of a belief in a judgmental God who then judges and people either get a reward or a punishment. Even if that punishment is non-existence, it's still negative against the reward, still not as good as a reward. Although arguably you can't compare the value of non-existence because it has no value. So there's an interesting side debate there. But the idea that some people get the goods and some people don't get the goods, what's going on there given God's omniscience and omnibenevolence and omnipotence? How do you explain that? I just can't. So what's the point of it all? What, as Christians, do you think the point of it all is? If it's to enter into a loving union with God, then why would God create people that he knows won't enter into a loving union with God? You're just creating people to condemn them. Why create all the people in the Amazon rainforest 5,000 years before the Bible was even written? What's going on there? And people like William Lane Craig say those are the people that would always come to reject God, and so God creates all those souls anyway before the revelation, because he knows they'd reject him anyway. Well, why create them if he knows he's the one that controls the design, is ultimately responsible for the design of these entities? Why create entities that you know 100% will reject you? So you front load them into a period before revelation. How about not creating them at all? Because then they're going to go through a suffering life and then not get the rewards of judgment. Just none of it makes any sense. Anyway, thoughts down below. Please like, subscribe, do all that kind of stuff. Thank you for all your support. Question everything, especially this kind of stuff.